throttling, various different authentication, authorization mechanisms, the ability to do things like measurement of customer traffic, such that you can do things like set up third-party APIs that can be consumed by your customers, a whole list of different features and capabilities. It's actually a really versatile product. It has a number of different ways that it can be configured, such that it can be used, say, by clients out on the internet, what we consider to be an edge endpoint. It can be used by services that exist inside of a region, called a region endpoint, or it can be used internally inside of your own, say, virtual private cloud or your own infrastructure. And it can connect to a whole host of different services, whether it be Lambda, or EC2, or containers, or even actually endpoints that exist both publicly on the internet anywhere, or privately inside of your own data center. And so API Gateway, very, very versatile, and kind of what I would consider to be kind of a bread and butter product for us at AWS these days. And there are customers running very massive REST APIs through Amazon API Gateway, with, again, not having to manage a single server for that layer of it. But now we see a really interesting trend in the industry, and there's been a couple of talks this year on this next topic, and it's been interesting to see it grow since last year, which is GraphQL. So many of you might be familiar with the fact that when you're building a REST-based API, typically what you end up having to do is make several calls to various different API endpoints to gather all the information that your application needs. What GraphQL does, which is a bit different, is it allows you to model the data such that you can query for just the parts that you need. And the parts that you need could live in, say, different data models, or even different completely housed data sources. And important to note that GraphQL has nothing to do with graph databases. That's a separate concept. So again, let's look a little bit further about how GraphQL works. So let's say that I have defined some models with some data here, and I have a to-do schema. So you see here it has an ID, it has a name, a description, and so forth. Now I could put a query in front of that where I specify just the records that I want. So I want the ID, the name, and the priority. And what will happen then is that GraphQL will return just that. Now I could have gone further here and had multiple models of data mapped out in my schema and made one query that could have extended across all of those, or multiple of them. And so this is a pretty big departure from what we've seen with REST-based APIs. Companies like Starbucks talk about how they have their mobile application talking to a GraphQL endpoint and how it's completely changed the way that they think about building their applications. And so again, GraphQL is really interesting. Now here at AWS, just last year, we launched a service called AWS AppSync. AWS AppSync is a essentially hosted GraphQL gateway, if you will, to a certain degree. It's got a number of different capabilities built into it, so it allows for things like real-time collaboration via webhooks, data synchronization, and also it can be put in front of a number of different data sources. So whereas with API Gateway, you typically are putting it in front of some sort of compute tier that talks to a database, you can actually put AppSync directly in front of databases such as DynamoDB, Elasticsearch, and even relational databases now. And so we're seeing people choose these technologies for various different reasons. And I would say that GraphQL has some drawbacks, REST APIs have some drawbacks. And so one thing that we see people asking is, can these two technologies be used side by side? So one interesting thing that we end up seeing, and this is maybe more from the API Gateway side of things, is that by and large, the majority of APIs that companies are building are private. In fact, we see somewhat about approximately a 10-to-1 ratio of private APIs to public APIs. Now, GraphQL is lending itself to be a really interesting technology for interfacing with external clients, whether they be completely external customers that are consuming an API of yours, or potentially it's, say, something like a mobile application, again with the example of what Starbucks has done, moving their mobile app to talking to a GraphQL endpoint. And so we see a world where these technologies can definitely coexist, where you would have, say, GraphQL powering the client side of things, or effectively what I consider to be the tip of the microservices iceberg. And then the internal services that you have, which are a little bit more defined, a little more structured, probably don't need the same kind of dynamicness and query capability. This is where REST fits in really well. And so there's definitely a world where REST and GraphQL can live side by side. So let's go back to the topic of serverless. How does all of this kind of help with development? Well, if we look at Lambda Functions, what we find by and large is that our customers are writing really, really small blocks of code that are their functions. If we look at a traditional monolithic application, you're typically talking tens of thousands, if not millions of lines of code for most enterprises. Companies that have moved to microservices, companies like Gilt and Airbnb, and a number of others, when they talk about their microservices in terms of lines of code, it's typically in the hundreds, maybe even thousands. But with Lambda, we're seeing companies break those functions down to the tens to maybe hundreds of lines of code. This has a really huge impact on how you think about building applications and how your development organization works with them. Just a couple of benefits here. So really simplified testing of code, right? You effectively have smaller chunks of logic, smaller code that you have to think about. Much easier to onboard new developers. So when a developer has to come in and learn a code base, being able to look at it in much smaller bite-sized chunks really helps them ramp up faster. Super fast deployment times, right? You're pushing less code, hopefully more often. When we talk about the world of agile and doing very quick, rapid iteration and development. You have the ability to use managed services to not have orchestration in your code. There's a product called AWS Step Functions, which I don't really cover today, but that would allow you to basically take the business workflow and separate that out from the business logic. Reduce blast radius of issues. If I deploy a bad Lambda function, it's only going to impact that one Lambda function. And then lastly, what we feel is greatly reduced technical debt. So as companies are leveraging these managed services and leveraging services like Lambda, which again are breaking down the application in much smaller chunks, it reduces basically the kind of effect that we have traditionally with at least monoliths where stuff keeps getting added on top of them. In this case, you would just have more Lambda functions. So if we put this all together, what can we do with this? What is kind of the vision of what happens here? And what we ask ourselves is, what happens if we greatly reduce the operational burden that our internal teams have? So for example, if they start leveraging serverless technologies such as Lambda, fronted by things like API Gateway and AppSync, what can we do to help change the way that they're operating? And we end up asking ourselves, what if 2 pizzas is one too many? Right? What if we've shifted so much away from that green circle into the blue circle of stuff that they can consume that we can free them up so much more to be more productive? And so what we're starting to explore and what we're starting to see is that essentially the benefits of serverless are incredibly drastic on the organization. Right? When we want to build a new product and build it in a serverless way, we can do it starting with less headcount. And we have less duties to necessarily take on in terms of the operational burden of managing our own services. Much more lower costs for experimentation, new ideas. Again, with the serverless products from Lambda to AppSync to API Gateway, if you're not paying for them, you're not using them. I mean, if you're not using them, you're not paying for them. And so in this sense, versus having, say, running fleets of servers all the time, we can now have environments that get no traffic but exist, and then could respond if they did get traffic. As we take services and we move them more into that blue circle that we have, we find that there's less drift between teams. And now this is really important because as people inside the organization maybe want to go and start a new project, go and move to a different team, or even inside of teams that want to launch new capabilities, they're not having to go and, say, reinvent the wheel more often than not. Also allows us to have much greater agility and time to market. We can move a lot faster, we can get code out a lot faster, we can iterate a lot more quickly. And again, the reduced technical debt over time is really key for us. And so in closing, when I think about all of this stuff put together here, so obviously I think this week and this conference is very key in showing the importance of APIs. APIs are without a doubt the future way that we're going to be building applications for the foreseeable future. It really kind of feels like what is going to be the next decade plus of how we build software. And it's kind of, in some degree, been the last decade of how we've built large-scale software. When it comes to REST and GraphQL, these are 2 technologies that, while they do compete with each other, very much can live together. And I think we're going to continue to see organizations where they have a mix of these 2 technologies, and they don't necessarily need to rip out one and replace it with the other. Serverless, in terms of removing the burden of needing to manage servers, of needing to think about scale, of having to worry about if you have enough capacity, of paying for resources that you're not using, greatly changes the game. And we're seeing today already companies of all shapes and sizes, from large financial institutions like Capital One through startups that are the smallest size, starting in dorm rooms, are leveraging serverless to build products quicker, faster, and at greater scale. And so the question that I leave everyone in the room here is, what are the things that your teams are doing that are in the green circle today that could be shifted to the blue circle for your organization? And I think what you find is if you start to look at leveraging more managed hosted services, more shared services across the organization, you could find yourself being able to drastically change the way that you build product. So with that, I want to thank you all for coming here today. I know this was kind of a quick session, so appreciate you coming here. My name is Chris Munns. I'm the lead developer advocate for serverless at AWS. You can find me at munns@amazon.com or at Chris Munns on Twitter. And I think I've got to free up the room here in 43 seconds, so I'll take questions out in the hall. But thanks again for coming. Have a great rest of your week.